Shalom, shalom. First and foremost, I have to give all praise and infinite glory to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Kakatosh, Yahweh, B'Shem, because God, Ba'ashem in the name of and Yahushai, B'Shem, was here in the call of Jesus, and the Kakatosh, and the Holy Spirit. I want us, Apostle Elders, great millstone, that rule out of the double honest, and peace and blessing over the out there, pushing the work of the Lord in true faith, sincerity, and promoting bodies of the sacrifice, showing them all as well. These are Brother Mashal. Today's implications are taken in this lesson. We'll be basically going over how, it's very important to, balance our time. It's very important to balance our time and ultimately, know how to separate, our time the right way or, our effort into things, because we have to understand that being a man of the Lord is a hard thing to do, man. You know what I'm saying? This is one of the hardest jobs ever, because not only do we go through things, obviously, in the flesh, because we're human, we also go through things, man, you know, spiritually, and emotionally, having to, have that duality of being, I like to say an analogy of being Bruce Wayne and being Batman, or, so it's like, you gotta know how to, ultimately balance those two versions of yourself, man, because, those two versions, of ourselves, man, keeps us sane, you know? Like you can't, feed one side more than the other side, man. Both, sides of us is required to keep us sane. So that means, you can't, be 100% man of the Lord all the time, man. You know what I'm saying? Because it's not natural to do. Because now, you're putting too much weight, you know what I'm saying, on a certain part of your life, you know what I'm saying? Which is therefore gonna cause imbalances, man. Lead to injury. You gotta look at it as like a muscle, you know, um, or a part of your body. If you're putting one, you're putting stress on one part of your body, you know what I'm saying, and you're not ultimately letting the other side heal. For instance, you hurt your left shoulder, right? And you don't let it heal. Your body is gonna go in defense mode and ultimately try to, stay stable. So that means it's gonna use, a lot of the strength from the right shoulder, because the right shoulder is the strongest right now. So it's gonna use that weight, you know what I'm saying, to ultimately, be able to hold that weight. You know what I'm saying? But however, since that left shoulder's hurt, that right shoulder, man, is going, overtime. It's overloading, and it's not gonna be strong enough to ultimately hold that, man, because it's just too much weight, So then, boom, now you hurt your right hand, your right, shoulder, you know what I'm saying, because you refused to let that left side, the shoulder heal, man. And it's the same thing in this truth, you know. If you're not making sure that that other part of you, you know what I'm saying, when you're not that man, which isn't the truth, isn't okay, you know what I'm saying, that other side of you, man, and it's gonna feed into you, not being the best man of the Lord you can be, You have to understand, we're only able to be the best man of the Lord we can be if, that Clark Kent side of us, man, that side of us where we're not engaging, in, prophesying, doing basically doing the things and, that nature, that a man of the Lord would do when you're in superhero mode, You know, you gotta think about it. If, Bruce Wayne, if Batman doesn't make sure Bruce Wayne's okay, doesn't make sure, the image of Bruce Wayne is still remains the same, you know, then that's gonna affect, him being Batman, basically spiritual us being a man of the Lord. Why? Because now people are gonna be like, dang, like, what's wrong with Bruce Wayne? Why the hell is he acting like this? He's not acting like himself. So then people are gonna start questioning. Then like, damn, we barely see Batman anymore. So then they're gonna put two and two together and be like, oh shit, maybe this guy is Batman. So literally, it has to be to the point that that other side of us, you know what I'm saying? Because most of the time, especially around the world, you're gonna be, in that Bruce Wayne state, that Clark Kent state more than you are gonna be a man of the Lord. You know what I'm saying? Because obviously, we can't blow our cover. So you have to ultimately understand that you got to take care of that part of yourself, man. You know, because in order to blend in and ultimately, keep that mask, and people shouldn't, that's how people get, skeptical, man. So you gotta make sure that part of yourself is all right. Because we already go through a lot of things emotionally. So sometimes you gotta do things. Sometimes I don't want to say you gotta take a break from the truth because we never take a break from the truth. But it's like sometimes you gotta do things that's gonna boost your spirit. And sometimes in order for you to like grow, you know what I'm saying, in this truth, sometimes because it's bigger than just doing lessons. It's bigger than just going to highways and byways and prophesying, feeding the sheep. It's also about going through, these things, man, that a man of the Lord is gonna go through. We have to face the persecution. We gotta go through these things. It's all part of our Lord, so to speak. So it's not just about only doing the work, it's actually about going through things, that a man of the Lord, is supposed to go through, man. And, that comes with, sometimes you may have to go through things that ultimately, are, emotional burden. But at the end of the day, through that fire, through that adversity, the Lord is showing you something. So you might be a brother that might post, every day, but the Lord might put the spirit on you to not post for a few days because you're going through that purification stage, man. Because you're figuring more about yourself. And that's what I learned, being in this truth, despite being a younger brother. I've been in this truth for quite some time. When I first came in, I was, on fire, posting videos every single day, But then as time went on, I started going through, what a man of the Lord is supposed to go through. So I'm like, I catch myself, I'm like, dang, now I'm not posting lessons anymore. I'm still posting lessons, but it's not the same because the Lord ultimately wants you to not only prophesy about being a man of the Lord, reading, we do all this reading, we do all this studying, but we also got to apply these things that we learn, into our life, man. So you got to be a walking scripture, so to speak. So that means you got to go through the things that were mentioned in the scriptures, man. Yahusha said, you should be persecuted for my name's sake. You're going to have to go through betrayal. You're going to have to see the people's true colors and stuff, man. So that's part of being a man of the Lord. So that comes with that emotional burden. So that's why it's important to balance your time. You can't be 100% man of the Lord all the time. And also you can't be 100%, Clark Kent, that other side of us, man, all the time, man. So you gotta be able to balance your time. You also gotta make sure, you're not always in work mode all the time. You gotta make sure you have some fun for yourself. Do things that boost your spirit, man, whatever it may be for you. Obviously in a righteous, manner, but make sure, you're taking care of that other side of you, man. If it's in the spirit for you to eat a burger or eat some cake, eat it, man. Obviously, we're not supposed to eat those things all the time, but there's sometimes in the spirit where you might have to, you know, eat some junk food to boost your spirit. You know what I'm saying? It's a once in a while thing. You know what I'm saying? You gotta have certain cheat days, so to speak, man. You know, even if you look at wrestlers and stuff, or professional athletes, bodybuilders, they're not just eating, plain food, that don't taste as good every single day. Now, there's one day in a week or every 2 weeks or whatever, occasion where they have a cheat meal. So sometimes you gotta have spiritual cheat meals, man. Sometimes you gotta, allow yourself to have some fun. You know what I'm saying? Go do something fun. Don't, you know, take a break, so to speak, man. Obviously, I'm not saying, bro, follow out the truth and stuff like that. Nah, when I say break, that's not what you think. Break just means, man, just allow that part of your body, that spiritual part of you, to rest a little bit, man. Sometimes you may need to take a day off from posting a lesson, man, because it's better to do a lesson in the spirit, naturally, than to force yourself to do a lesson for no reason and you're not really in the spirit. You know what I'm saying? So what I'm really trying to say is, man, trust your spirit, man. You gotta trust the spirit. Sometimes you want, to do things a certain way. You want to be perfect. You want to have a routine. But sometimes our routine can be broken. So you gotta know how to adapt, man. And that comes with balance. Because when you're balanced, when you're flexible, you're able to adapt and put your body in different ways, put your mind in different ways, man. So this is why it's very important, man. To make sure you're balancing your time. Not putting so much time into being one part of yourself, or doing one task, and that's something, I've been experiencing lately too, and I've ultimately learned from that situation is that, you can't, especially we're Jakes, man, we're a jack of all trades, so to speak. You know what I'm saying? So even in my spirit, it's like, it's in my spirit to where I can't do the same thing for so long. I always gotta switch up the flow, switch up the, have a different flavor to it, man. So try to do that, man, You might, for instance, little things. So it could be minor things. Like you might do lessons on, YouTube or whatever. You might do faceless videos. You know what I'm saying? Why don't you, switch the flow a little bit and start, incorporating your face more in the lessons, Or it's something I do through the spirit, I be changing, the type of font I use for my videos. I might write, all uppercase, you know what I'm saying, some lowercase, whatever, you know what I'm saying? Just switch up the flow, because it gives you a kind of, it gives your brain kind of an illusion that you're off to a fresh start, but even if it's a minor thing, man, just do things that's constantly, keep you refreshed, even, you gotta look at it, for example, when an app is not working, you know what I'm saying, or something like that on your phones, whatever, don't you refresh it, right? It's the same thing. You gotta be able to refresh things when the service is not too good, when the things are buffering in your life. You gotta be able to know when to refresh it, or the Wi-Fi signal may not be that good. Sometimes you gotta unplug the Wi-Fi router, turn it back on so it could work better, man. So it's just, we gotta understand, that we need to rest sometimes, man. You gotta be able to rest. You gotta listen to your body, because your body will never lie to you, man. You know what I'm saying? And a lot of people think, rest is a bad thing, but nah, you have to understand, rest is how you recover. Rest is how you, actually build the muscle, man, so to speak. So it's the same thing spiritually and mentally, man. Sometimes you gotta take a break from things, man, in order to come back stronger. You know what I'm saying? You might have to change it. What I've noticed lately, man, a little work is better than no work at all. Even if you might not be on fire, you know what I'm saying? For instance, you probably could do 1,000 push-ups or whatever, right? Boom, you're used to doing that, but you get hurt, you come back. you do 50 push-ups now. That's okay because you're still doing some type of work. It's about the quality over the quantity, man. You could do 8 lessons in a day. You know what I'm saying? You could go on the highways and byways for 24 hours. But at the end of the day, you have to remember, if you're not in the spirit and if you're burnt out, man, you're not going to perform to your best of your ability, man. You know? Because in this truth, man, especially being a person that, juggles a lot of things, you have a lot of responsibilities to handle. You can get burned out. But at the end of the day, there's nothing wrong with getting burned out. But most importantly, you got to have that awareness. You got to understand yourself. You got to look yourself in the mirror. You got to talk to yourself. That's what I've been doing lately. Like, people might think you're weird or whatever. Talk to yourself, man. Literally. Even if it's you talking out loud to yourself, talk to yourself, man. Because, besides having the Father, of course, you understand yourself best, man. So you got to talk to yourself. You got to be aware. You be like, damn, what's wrong with me, man? I know something's wrong with me, man. Then you have that pep talk. That's why I call myself, man. I was going through a state of heavy procrastination, man. And it was carrying on to other areas of my life. Why? Because I was ultimately burnt out, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. So I had to catch myself, even though other people from the outside may not realize that. At the end of the day, you know yourself best, man. So you gotta know when you're burnt out. So this is why it's important, to have some free time, with yourself, man. Sometimes as a man of the Lord, you could be it depends your situation. You could be around a lot of brothers all day, around people. Sometimes you gotta spend that isolated time with yourself to better understand yourself, man. So whenever you're going through, things, what I'm saying, you may be experiencing burnout and stuff like that, you gotta understand that, you gotta isolate yourself. You might have to be by yourself for a little while in order to come back and get stronger, man, and recharge, so to speak, man. So yeah, man, like, it's very important to have that awareness because a lot of people think, oh, they're fine. Yeah, you might be good on the outside, so you might not feel no pain on the outside, but internally you're going through a lot of pain. So you gotta look at the little signals, man. That's really what I'm learning, man, in this truth, recently is that, man, you gotta listen to your body, man. You gotta listen to your body because, sometimes pain is an indicator to stop, man. Sometimes you be like, oh, yeah, push through it, whatever. Yeah, it's good to push through things, but the maturity is when, there's only a certain limit. There's a certain threshold. Everything has a certain threshold, man. Even electric circuits, stuff like that. There's a certain threshold, a certain limit. Everything has a limit, man. You know what I'm saying? Especially the only thing that doesn't necessarily have a limit is the spirit. But at the end of the day, we have to understand that we're in the flesh, So we have to understand this flesh has a limit, man, So we got to respect that, man. We got to ultimately respect that. And, we do that by trusting the spirit, man. The spirit will tell you when to, chill out. You know what I'm saying? The ego might be like, oh, keep going. But the spirit's going to be like, yo, chill. You know what I'm saying? You don't got to do this, man. You don't got to do all this extra stuff. Just take a break, man. You may seem weak and stuff, but nah, man. Through rest, that's how you really grow, man. That's where growth happens, is through rest. So just keep that in mind, man, and just practice balance, man. If you just put all your weight onto one thing, that's going to lead to imbalances, which therefore lead to injuries, man. Now you out for a long time, Now you can't even appreciate the gains. You basically got the gains for no reason. Why do the gains matter if you're just going to get hurt and then not be able to work out for a couple months, Now you're out for longer than you would have been if you just would have rested, man. So that's what comes with just being, spiritually mature, man, in this truth. You gotta understand when to stop. A true master knows when to stop. You know what I'm saying? even in sports, there's a saying, that, slow is pro. You got to know how to go slow. You know what I'm saying? Because at the end of the day, the race was not made for the swift. You have to understand this thing is a marathon, man. If you just use all your energy, you know what I'm saying, in the beginning of the marathon, you're not gonna have any energy left to cross the finish line. So it's the same thing. You gotta understand, you gotta know how to pace yourself, man, in this thing. Of course, you want to push your limits. That's our mentality. We're supposed to strive, to be the best version of ourselves, go as hard as you can. But at the end of the day, you got to know there's certain limits. But sometimes through rest, you're able to enhance your limits, man. You're able to go past your limits. You feel me? So yeah, man, you got to look at rest as, don't look at it as rest, but look at it as recharging. You see when your phone dies and your phone's on low percent, if you keep using it, eventually it's gonna die fast. But once you put that shit in charge, and now it's at 100%, now you're able to use your phone for longer, man. It's the same thing with yourself, man. You gotta be able to balance, yourself, man. Know when you need to take a break. Know when you need to, focus on yourself, man. You know? And, you gotta understand that the Lord knows you best, man. So the Lord might, have it, not in the spirit for you to post a lesson this day or go in the highways and byways. You know what I'm saying? For you to recharge, so to speak, man. And you gotta understand the Lord will do that sometimes, man. It's not you going off. No, that's the Lord basically saying, bro, you need to chill out. You need to recharge, and you can go out and be stronger, man. So yeah, man, but most importantly though, when you do take a break, so to speak, you chill. Obviously, you gotta remain in the spirit. You gotta constantly be meditating on the scriptures, and stuff like that. But sometimes you may not be able to put in physical work because there may be things in the way. But obviously, we make no excuses. We try to do things to the best of our ability. That's why the elders say to the best of our ability. Why? Because we're in the flesh. We're not going to be perfect all the time. So once you accept that, it relieves a lot of stress, man. Because who doesn't want to be on fire for the Lord? Everybody wants to be on fire for the Lord. But sometimes you're not going to be able to be 100% on fire all the time, and you have to grow to accept that. But at the end of the day, the Lord, loves the effort that people put in because nobody's perfect, man. You can't be perfect in this flesh. So it's about, doing things to the best of your ability, man, and ultimately knowing your limits, man. That's where maturity comes, man. You know? So, with that, let me find to give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yoshai, Ba'ashem Kakadash, Shalom, Baba, Dev to America.